When billionaire Elijah Crane's quest for redemption collides with Desmond Carter's pursuit of justice, buried secrets ignite a deadly game of power, betrayal, and sacrifice. As dark truths unravel, the stakes soar higher than either imagined, forcing them to confront their shared past and a ruthless enemy who thrives in the shadows. Can they destroy the legacy that binds them, or will it destroy them first? Elijah Crane sat in the back seat of his limo, the cityscape of towering glass and steel flashing past his window. The vehicle glided silently over the rain-slicked streets, its interior cloaked in an unnatural hush. Elijah's eyes, dark and unyielding, fixed on his phone screen as stock updates and reports flickered by. Numbers. They were the only constant, the only thing he could control in a world that had long since turned its back on him. Outside, the city pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the cold void Elijah carried inside him. He glanced up for a moment, catching his own reflection in the tinted glass. A face sharp with age and precision, its lines etched not by years, but by ruthless determination. "You'll be late for the charity gala, sir," his driver, Simmons, remarked from the front. "I'm always late," Elijah replied without emotion, his voice smooth and detached. The gala was another meaningless event, an opportunity for wealthy socialites to flaunt their contributions to worthy causes while sipping champagne. Elijah didn't care for these events, but appearances had to be maintained. His donations funded hospitals, schools, and shelters, yet they did little to lighten the weight he carried, a weight he rarely acknowledged. The car slowed as they neared the lavish venue, a sprawling hotel adorned with golden lights. Even from a distance, Elijah could hear the hum of chatter and laughter, a mockery of warmth and connection. He prepared himself to step out into that world of shallow indulgence, but then a disturbance caught his attention. Just outside the venue's entrance, a young man argued with security guards. Rain soaked his clothes, but he stood tall, his voice sharp and unrelenting. The scene was unusual enough to pull Elijah's gaze away from his phone. "Stop the car," he ordered, his tone cutting through the quiet. Simmons hesitated but complied, pulling over a few yards from the commotion. Elijah rolled down the window slightly, letting the muffled sound of voices drift in. "I don't want your charity," the man shouted at the guards. His voice was raw, defiant, and laced with desperation. "We told you, this is private property. You can't be here begging." One of the guards snapped back. The man clutched a battered saxophone case in one hand, his other clenched tightly into a fist. Despite his drenched and disheveled appearance, there was something unyielding about him. Elijah stepped out of the car, ignoring the driver's concerned glance. The cold rain hit his tailored suit, but he didn't flinch. His polished shoes clicked against the wet pavement as he approached the scene. "What's going on here?" Elijah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The guards immediately stiffened, recognizing him. "Mr. Crane, this man's been loitering and causing a disturbance." "I wasn't loitering," the young man interrupted, glaring at the guards. "I was trying to talk to someone who could actually help." Elijah turned his full attention to him. The young man's face was taut with anger, but there was no mistaking the vulnerability in his eyes. He couldn't have been older than his mid-20s, but the hard lines of his expression spoke of struggles far beyond his years. "And who are you?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but commanding. "Desmond Carter," the man replied, straightening despite the rain streaming down his face. "My sister's in trouble. I need help, and no one's willing to listen." The guards began to interject, but Elijah raised a hand to silence them. "Let him speak." Desmond hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "My sister, Talia, is being held by people who won't let her go unless I pay them back. Loan sharks. She needed money for our mom's medical bills. I've tried everything, working, borrowing, selling everything we had, but it's not enough. I came here because you have the means to help, and I'm not leaving until someone does." There was a fire in Desmond's voice, an edge of desperation that pulled at something long buried within Elijah. For a fleeting moment, he saw himself reflected in the young man, a raw determination to survive, to fight for someone who mattered. "Why should I believe you?" Elijah asked. "Because I'm standing here in the rain begging. when I'd rather be anywhere else, Desmond snapped. Because if I walk away, she's as good as dead. The rawness of his words silenced everyone. Elijah studied him for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. Here. He scribbled an amount, tore the check free, and handed it to Desmond. Take this and handle it. Desmond stared at the check, his hands trembling. This is too much. Elijah arched a brow. Then don't waste it. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, but Elijah ignored them. He turned to leave, but Desmond's voice stopped him. Why? Desmond asked. Why are you doing this? Elijah paused, his back still to the young man. Because I can. Without another word, he returned to the limo. Simmons handed him a towel, which Elijah ignored as he sank into his seat. The encounter replayed in his mind, the intensity of Desmond's desperation and conviction stirring something unfamiliar. He glanced at his phone, intending to return to his reports, but a notification caught his eye. It was an old photo of his father's staff from decades ago, part of a digital archive he'd been reviewing for a company retrospective. In the corner of the image stood a young woman, barely visible but unmistakably familiar. The curve of her face, the tilt of her head. It was the same woman from the photograph Desmond had dropped earlier. Elijah's grip tightened around his phone. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a memory he'd tried to forget. Take me home, Simmons, he ordered quietly. As the limo pulled away, Elijah stared out at the rain-soaked streets, his mind churning with questions he wasn't ready to confront. Elijah Crane stood in his sprawling penthouse, the city lights casting fractured reflections across the glass walls. He sipped a glass of scotch, the rich burn doing little to ease his restless thoughts. The image of Desmond Carter's face, the fire in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, lingered in his mind like a ghost. It wasn't like him to get personally involved. Money was his armor, a way to keep people at a distance, yet something about Desmond had cracked through that wall. The vibration of his phone on the marble countertop broke his reverie. A number he didn't recognize. Crane, he answered curtly. There was a pause before Desmond's voice came through, sharp and uneven. You said not to waste it. Well, here's the thing. I need more. Elijah's grip tightened around the glass. He didn't like being cornered, but curiosity flickered beneath his irritation. You squandered it already? No, Desmond snapped, his frustration palpable. I used it exactly how I said I would. But these people, they don't just want money. They want power, leverage. The debt wasn't just about cash. It was a hook into my sister's life, and now mine. Why call me? Elijah asked, his tone laced with measured indifference. Do I look like a saint to you? I don't need a saint, Desmond shot back. I need someone who understands how people like them work. You have resources, connections, a way to dig deeper. And what do you have to offer in return? Elijah's voice was cold, his instinct to dismiss the plea already kicking in. Another pause, longer this time. Then Desmond's voice dropped, quieter, more controlled. I have information about your family, things I think you don't know, and things I know you wouldn't want exposed. The room seemed to freeze. Elijah's expression darkened, and he set the glass down carefully. Careful, he said, his voice dangerously low. You're walking a fine line, Carter. I don't care about your reputation, Desmond said, his words blunt and unwavering. I care about saving my sister. But if you're as smart as everyone says, you'll want to hear what I have. Elijah's pulse quickened, but his exterior remained unreadable. Desmond had his attention now, though he wasn't about to show it. Where? Your call, Desmond replied. But make it soon. I don't have much time. Elijah ended the call without another word. His jaw tightened as he stared at the city below, his mind racing. If Desmond was bluffing, it was a bold gamble. If he wasn't, then Elijah needed to find out exactly what skeletons the stranger was threatening to unearth. An hour later, Elijah's sleek black car pulled up to a shadowy diner on the city's outskirts. It was a far cry from his usual haunts, grimy windows, flickering neon signs, and the faint smell of stale grease in the air. Inside, Desmond sat alone in a booth, hunched over a coffee cup. Elijah entered without hesitation, his sharp suit and commanding presence drawing a few wary glances from the few patrons scattered around the room. He slid into the booth across from Desmond, who looked up with a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. "You've got 5 minutes," Elijah said, his voice clipped. Desmond leaned back, his fingers tapping against the table. "I did some digging. Turns out your family name isn't as clean as you think. Your father, Arthur Crane, wasn't just a businessman. He had ties to some very unsavory people." Elijah's jaw tensed, but he gave nothing away. "If you think this is news to me, you're mistaken." "Then let me add something you might not know," Desmond said, leaning forward now. "My mother worked for your family. She was one of your father's assistants, and she disappeared under mysterious circumstances." Elijah's expression didn't waver, but inside, a fissure formed. "Coincidence," he said evenly. "Your mother's choices don't concern me." "Maybe," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But the Crane family's choices concern me plenty. I found records, payments, written off as operational expenses, linked to a property on the edge of the city. My sister was being held there. I don't think it's the first time something like this has happened." A ripple of unease swept through Elijah. "You're suggesting my father was involved in—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Desmond interrupted. "I'm saying there's a pattern. And if you're half as smart as they say, you'll want to know the full picture before it comes crashing down on you." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust Desmond, not yet. But the man's conviction was impossible to ignore. If there was even a shred of truth in what he was saying, Elijah needed to act. He couldn't afford to let this spiral out of control. "And what do you want in return?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp. "Help me find out who's pulling the strings. If my sister and I are caught in the middle of something bigger, I need to know what we're dealing with." Desmond's voice hardened. "And if your family's responsible, I want justice." Elijah's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Justice? From a man who just blackmailed me?" "Call it what you want," Desmond said. "But you and I both know how this world works. Sometimes you have to play dirty to get results." Elijah regarded him in silence for a moment. Desmond's boldness was reckless, but there was no denying his determination. And as much as Elijah loathed being backed into a corner, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Desmond's claims might lead to something bigger. "I'll help you," Elijah said finally, his tone clipped. "But make no mistake, if you're lying, you'll wish you'd never approached me." Desmond didn't flinch. "Deal." As Elijah rose from the table, his mind churned with possibilities. This wasn't just about Desmond or his sister anymore. If there was truth to these allegations, it threatened not only his family's name, but the very foundation of the empire he had built. And for the first time in years, Elijah felt something he wasn't used to: uncertainty. Elijah Crane rarely felt out of control. His power lay in the precision of his actions, the ability to anticipate and outmaneuver challenges before they could take root. Yet, as he stood in the cavernous depths of his private archive room, the cool blue glow of computer screens casting sharp shadows across his face, he felt an unfamiliar edge of unease creeping in. Desmond Carter leaned against the edge of a desk nearby, his eyes darting around the room in thinly veiled amazement. Rows of digitized records, filing cabinets, and encrypted servers surrounded them, the lifeblood of the Crane Empire stored in one sterile, impenetrable chamber. "This is insane," Desmond muttered, his voice a mixture of awe and disdain. "Do you have a file on everyone in the city, or just your enemies?" Elijah shot him a sharp glance. "If you're done gawking, I suggest we focus." Desmond raised his hands defensively but didn't press further. He'd learned quickly that Elijah wasn't the type of man to tolerate idle chatter. Still, Desmond's mind raced. If even a fraction of the resources in this room were turned toward uncovering the truth, they might actually stand a chance of unraveling the threads that bound their lives together. "Show me the records you mentioned," Elijah said, his tone clipped. Desmond stepped forward and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a list of transactions he discovered through his own investigation. He placed it on the desk, smoothing it out with calloused fingers. "These payments," Desmond said, tapping the page, "are tied to an off-the-books account in your father's name. The money was funneled through shell companies and sent to a property on the city's outskirts. That's where I found my sister. Elijah scanned the list, his mind working rapidly to connect the dots. He recognized the account numbers, though they had long been closed. His father had always been meticulous in covering his tracks, yet here was a glaring inconsistency. A trail left behind, either by carelessness or intent. This property, Elijah said, his voice low. You're sure it's linked to my father? Desmond nodded, his expression hardening. I found his signature on one of the deeds. The place is abandoned now, but it's clear something went down there. My sister described rooms that looked like holding cells. Whoever used it, they weren't just collecting debts, they were running an operation. Elijah's gaze darkened, memories of his father's authoritarian control flickering through his mind. Arthur Crane had always presented himself as a paragon of morality, a philanthropist whose only crime was success. But Elijah knew better. The man had built his empire with ruthless pragmatism, cutting corners and people when it suited him. I need more than your word, Elijah said finally. This isn't enough to accuse him of anything, let alone involve me. Desmond clenched his jaw. I figured you'd say that. That's why I brought this. He reached into his bag and pulled out an old photograph. Elijah's breath hitched the moment he saw it. The image was faded, its edges worn with time, but the faces were unmistakable. Arthur Crane stood in the center, flanked by two other men Elijah recognized as longtime business associates. But it was the woman standing just to the side, half hidden behind Arthur, that seized his attention. Desmond placed the photo on the desk, his voice cutting through Elijah's silence. That's my mother, Yvonne Carter, the assistant your father hired when I was just a kid. Elijah's fingers grazed the edge of the photo as he stared at the woman's face. She looked younger than he remembered, her expression tentative but warm. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just some distant connection. Yvonne had been a presence in his life, if only for a short time, when he was a boy. She had worked for his father during one of the most tumultuous periods of his childhood, right before his brother Victor had been sent away. She disappeared, Desmond continued, his voice tightening with anger. No explanation, no warning. Just vanished. My father told me it was because of the Crane family. He said she got too close to something dangerous. Elijah looked up sharply. Your father told you this? Desmond hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Yeah, before he disappeared too. I was just a kid, but I remember him telling me to stay away from people like you. Said you'd ruin everything if I ever crossed your path. Elijah's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but the picture remained incomplete. His father's shadow loomed over every revelation, growing darker with each detail Desmond unearthed. Did you find anything else at the property? Elijah asked. Just this, Desmond replied, pulling out a crumpled blueprint. He spread it across the desk, revealing the layout of the building where Talia had been held. It was a sprawling structure, its basement marked with heavily reinforced rooms and strange symbols Elijah didn't recognize. These markings, Elijah murmured, tracing one with his finger. They're not standard. I thought you'd know, Desmond said, his tone pointed. Since it's tied to your family. Elijah ignored the jab, his focus fixed on the blueprint. The markings reminded him of something, a fragment of a conversation he'd overheard as a child, hushed voices discussing containment and risk mitigation. His father's voice, cold and commanding, had been at the center of it. Where is the property? Elijah asked. Desmond crossed his arms. Why? Planning to clean up the mess? Elijah's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. If you want my help, Carter, you'll stop questioning my motives. I have more to lose than you do if this gets out. For a moment, they locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Then Desmond relented, scribbling the address onto a scrap of paper. It's yours, he said. But if you're going to do something, do it fast. Whoever ran that place is still out there, and they're not just going to let this slide. Elijah folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. As he turned to leave, Desmond called after him. And Crane? Elijah paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Whatever you find, Desmond said quietly, Just remember, my sister and I didn't choose this. Your family dragged us into it." Elijah said nothing, his silence heavy with unspoken truths. He left the room, his mind a storm of questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Elijah's car rolled to a halt in front of the decrepit mansion Desmond had described. The property loomed like a relic from another era, its once stately facade now cracked and consumed by ivy. The air around it was unnervingly still, as if the building itself had long since been abandoned by life and by hope. Desmond sat rigid in the passenger seat, his jaw tight as he stared at the house. His sister had spent days in that place, held against her will by people who saw her as nothing more than collateral. The thought made his blood boil, but it was the uncertainty that gnawed at him. The Crane family was tied to this somehow. He just didn't know how deep the rot went. "You're certain this is the place?" Elijah asked, his voice measured but tense. Desmond's glare was sharp. "I don't forget things like this." Elijah nodded, saying nothing more. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. Desmond followed close behind, his shoulders hunched, his battered jacket a stark contrast to Elijah's polished appearance. The mansion's interior was worse than the outside suggested. The air reeked of mildew, and the once grand staircase sagged under years of decay. Desmond led the way, his steps deliberate as he pushed open door after door, revealing dusty, empty rooms. "It's in the basement," he said finally, his voice grim. "That's where they kept her." Elijah followed without a word, descending the narrow, creaking staircase. The air grew colder as they went, and when they reached the bottom, a chilling sight awaited them. The basement was sprawling, its walls lined with heavy iron doors. Symbols, identical to those on the blueprints, were scrawled across the surfaces in faded paint. Desmond stopped in front of one door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. He hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside was a small, barren room. Concrete walls, a single cot, and shackles bolted to the floor. A blanket lay crumpled in the corner, a faint stain marking its edge. "This was her cell," Desmond said, his voice low and hollow. "She said they barely fed her. Kept the lights off most of the time." Elijah stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the space. A lump formed in his throat, though he didn't show it. The scene was hauntingly familiar, a fragment of a buried memory flickering in the back of his mind. He knelt beside the blanket, his fingers brushing the stain. "Did she tell you who brought her here?" he asked. "She didn't know their names," Desmond replied, his hands clenching into fists. "But she said they mentioned your family. That's why I came to you." Elijah stood, his expression unreadable. "This operation, if my father was involved, it wasn't just about debts. These markings, they're not standard. Whoever ran this place had a larger agenda." Desmond's voice sharpened. "You think I care about their agenda? I care about what they did to her." Before Elijah could respond, a faint sound echoed through the basement, a soft shuffle, followed by the creak of a door. Both men froze. "You hear that?" Desmond whispered. Elijah nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He motioned for Desmond to stay back, but Desmond ignored him, stepping cautiously toward the source of the noise. In the dim light, a shadow moved at the far end of the basement. Desmond lunged, grabbing hold of a figure and pinning them against the wall. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. The figure struggled, then gasped, "Desmond, it's me." Desmond froze, his grip loosening as he recognized the voice. "Talia?" She slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, but her eyes burned with defiance. "Let me go." Desmond stepped back, his shock evident. "What are you doing here?" "I thought—" "I came back," she interrupted, brushing him off. "I couldn't let it go." Elijah stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "What do you mean, you came back? This place should be deserted." Talia shot him a look of disdain but didn't answer right away. She turned to Desmond, her voice trembling. "They're still watching us. I heard them talking when they had me here. They said you wouldn't stop, that you dig too deep." Desmond frowned. "Who's watching us? The loan sharks?" Talia shook her head. No. Someone higher up. Someone who wanted you to come here. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elijah narrowed his eyes, a cold suspicion creeping into his mind. Are you saying this was a setup? He asked. Talia hesitated, then nodded. Yes. They wanted you here, both of you. And they told me if I didn't cooperate, they'd make sure Desmond didn't leave this place alive. Desmond's face twisted with anger. You knew about this and you didn't tell me? I didn't have a choice, she shot back, her voice cracking. You don't know what they're capable of. Elijah cut in, his voice like steel. Who are they? Who's behind this? Talia's gaze flickered between them, fear etched into her features. I don't know their names, but I know who they work for. Who? Desmond demanded. Talia looked at Elijah, her expression a mixture of fear and accusation. Your brother, Victor Crane. The name hit Elijah like a thunderclap. His older brother, long presumed dead, had been a ghost in his life for years. If Victor was alive and involved, then this wasn't just a power struggle. It was personal. Elijah's mind reeled as the implications set in. Victor had always been ambitious, but to orchestrate something like this? To involve Desmond and his sister? It was a move designed to dismantle everything Elijah had built. We need to leave, Elijah said abruptly, his voice cold and decisive. If Victor's involved, this isn't over. Desmond looked ready to argue, but one glance at Talia's haunted expression silenced him. He grabbed her arm, guiding her toward the stairs. As they ascended, Elijah's thoughts churned. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Victor's shadow loomed large, threatening to pull them all into its depths. And for the first time, Elijah felt the weight of an enemy he might not be able to outmaneuver. Elijah Crane paced the length of his penthouse office, the tension in his movements betraying the icy composure he usually maintained. The name Victor Crane echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain, pulling up memories he had buried long ago. His brother's face, smirking, calculating, always one step ahead, surfaced like an unwanted ghost. Victor had been banished from their family decades ago, a casualty of their father's ruthless ambition. Elijah had been too young to understand the details then, but he remembered the night Victor had disappeared, their father's booming voice echoing through the estate, followed by Victor's shouted curses. He remembered the way his mother had cried, and the silence that followed when no one spoke his brother's name again. Now, after all these years, Victor wasn't just alive. He was pulling the strings behind a sinister operation that had ensnared Desmond and Talia. The elevator dinged, snapping Elijah out of his thoughts. Desmond stepped into the office, his jaw set in barely contained frustration. Behind him, Talia lingered in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room nervously. You called us up here. What's the plan? Desmond asked, his tone sharp. Elijah turned to face them, his expression hard. We need to find Victor before he makes another move. Desmond crossed his arms. And how exactly do you plan to do that? The guy's a ghost. If my sister hadn't overheard his name, we wouldn't even know he exists. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. Victor always had a penchant for theatrics. If he surfaced now, it's because he wants me to know he's out there. This is a game to him. He'll reveal himself soon enough. Talia spoke up, her voice hesitant. What if it's more than a game? He didn't just want you to know, Elijah. He wanted you here. At that house. Why? Elijah's gaze flicked to her, his eyes narrowing. To provoke me. Victor knows how to push buttons, but he doesn't make moves without purpose. Desmond scoffed. Great. So we sit around waiting for him to make the next move? Sounds like a solid plan. Elijah ignored the jab and walked to a side table, where a decanter of scotch gleamed under the light. He poured himself a glass, the steady motion a contrast to the storm brewing inside him. No, we need to anticipate him. Victor is calculated, but he's also vain. He'll want an audience for whatever comes next. Desmond stepped closer, his fists clenched. You're talking like this is some family squabble. My sister and I got dragged into this. People like Victor don't stop until someone makes them stop. Elijah raised the glass to his lips, taking a slow sip before replying. That's exactly what I intend to do. Before Desmond could retort, the intercom buzzed. Simmons' voice came through, calm but urgent. Sir, there's someone here asking for you. He claims to be Victor Crane. Elijah froze, the glass hovering an inch from his lips. For a moment, no one moved, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a lead blanket. Send him up, Elijah said, his voice steady. Desmond's eyes widened. Are you serious? What if this is a trap? Elijah set the glass down and adjusted his cufflinks. Then it's better to face it on my terms. Talia moved closer to her brother, her expression filled with unease. Desmond, maybe we should? We're not going anywhere, Desmond said firmly, his jaw tightening. If Victor's involved in this, we need to know why. The elevator dinged again, and a moment later, Victor Crane stepped into the room. He was older than Elijah remembered, but the years hadn't dulled the sharpness in his eyes or the air of arrogance that clung to him like a second skin. His tailored suit fit impeccably, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he surveyed the room. Well, Victor drawled, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Look at the mighty Elijah Crane, still dressing like you've got something to prove. Elijah's gaze was ice. And you're still alive. A shame. Victor chuckled, unbothered by the jab. Charming as ever, little brother. Desmond took a step forward, his fists clenched. You're the one behind all of this, aren't you? The kidnapping, the threats. You're the reason my sister almost died. Victor's gaze flicked to Desmond, his smirk deepening. Ah, the Carter siblings. Such spirit. You remind me of someone. What was her name? Yvonne? The name hit like a thunderclap. Desmond surged forward, but Elijah raised a hand, stopping him. Don't, Elijah said coldly. That's exactly what he wants. Victor's smirk faltered, if only for a second. Always the calm one, Elijah. It's what Father loved about you. It's also why he underestimated me. Get to the point, Elijah said. Why are you here? Victor's expression darkened, the smirk vanishing. To take back what's mine. While you were polishing your reputation, I was left to clean up Father's messes. The things I've done, the people I've dealt with, you wouldn't last a day in my world. Elijah's jaw tightened. You made your choices. Don't pin them on me. Victor stepped closer, his tone turning venomous. You have no idea what I've been through. While you sat in that mansion pretending to be the golden child, I was exiled, forgotten. But I didn't just survive, I thrived. And now, I'm here to finish what our father started. Desmond cut in, his voice sharp. What does any of this have to do with us? Why drag my family into your vendetta? Victor turned to him, his gaze calculating. Because your family is part of the Crane legacy, whether you like it or not. Your mother knew too much. She became a liability. Desmond's fist clenched. What are you saying? Victor's smirk returned, cruel and unapologetic. I'm saying your mother didn't just disappear. She was eliminated. Talia gasped, and Desmond's fury boiled over. He lunged at Victor, but Elijah moved faster, stepping between them and shoving Desmond back. Enough. Elijah barked, his voice commanding. Victor, you're playing a dangerous game. Victor tilted his head, his smirk never faltering. Danger is the family business, little brother. You should know that better than anyone. He turned to leave, his parting words cutting through the tension like a knife. You know where to find me when you're ready to face the truth. As the elevator doors closed behind him, silence filled the room. Desmond's chest heaved with rage, his fists trembling at his sides. He's lying, Desmond said, his voice shaking. He has to be. Elijah didn't respond, his mind already racing. Victor's arrival wasn't just a power play, it was a declaration of war. And if what he said about Yvonne was true, the stakes were higher than Elijah had ever imagined. The tension in Elijah's penthouse was suffocating. Desmond paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his movements erratic, his mind clearly racing. Talia sat stiffly on the edge of the leather couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting between her brother and Elijah. The silence between them wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, brimming with unspoken questions and mistrust. Elijah stood near his desk, his back turned to them as he stared out at the city skyline. He held his phone tightly, considering a call that could shift the balance of everything. Victor's words echoed in his head. Your mother didn't just disappear. She was eliminated. Finally, Desmond broke the silence. We can't just sit here. Victor's out there, gloating about killing my mother, and we're doing nothing? Elijah turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Do you think storming after him without a plan will solve anything? He wants you to act impulsively. It's his way of keeping control. Desmond's jaw clenched. Control? He's already ahead of us. He knows everything about you, about my family, and you just let him walk out of here. I let him leave, Elijah said coldly, because we're not prepared. If Victor is as dangerous as he wants us to believe, then we can't afford mistakes. Talia's voice, quiet but firm, cut through the argument. You think he's bluffing about our mother? The question hung in the air, heavy and raw. Elijah's eyes softened briefly as he looked at her, then turned to Desmond. I don't think Victor ever bluffs, but that doesn't mean he's telling the whole truth. Desmond let out a bitter laugh. You're unbelievable. He flat out admitted to having her killed, and you're still playing it cool? Elijah's tone sharpened. And if I lose my head, what then? You think fury will make Victor slip up? No, it'll only strengthen his hand. Desmond's pacing stopped abruptly. He turned to Talia, his voice softening. You said he mentioned Mom before, didn't you? When they were holding you. Talia nodded reluctantly. He didn't say much, just that she'd been involved with things she shouldn't have been, and that her mistake cost her everything. Desmond's face twisted with anger, but Elijah focused on the detail. What did he mean by involved with things she shouldn't have been? Did he specify? Talia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, but there was something else. Something I didn't tell you before. Desmond's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? She glanced at Elijah nervously before continuing. Victor didn't just talk about our mother. He mentioned you. Elijah's brow furrowed. Me? Talia nodded. He said you're as much to blame as your father. That you benefited from everything your family did, even if you pretended not to know. Desmond's head snapped toward Elijah. What's that supposed to mean? Elijah's gaze remained steady, though tension rippled beneath the surface. It means Victor's trying to sow doubt. He wants to pit us against each other because he knows that division is his greatest weapon. But is it true? Desmond pressed, stepping closer. Did you know what your father was doing? About the shell companies, the bribes, any of it? Elijah's jaw tightened. I suspected things weren't as clean as they seemed, but I was a child when most of this started. By the time I took control of the company, the damage was already done. Desmond scoffed. Convenient excuse. Elijah's eyes flashed. You think this is convenient for me? That I enjoy cleaning up my father's messes and bearing the weight of his sins? If I had known the full extent of it, I would have burned it all down. Then maybe it's time you do that, Desmond shot back. Because whatever your family built, it's rotten to the core. Before Elijah could respond, Talia stood, her voice trembling. Stop it, both of you. We don't have time for this. Her words silenced them. She turned to Desmond, her expression pained. I know you want answers. So do I. But fighting him, she gestured toward Elijah, won't bring Mom back. It won't fix anything. Desmond's shoulders sagged, his anger giving way to exhaustion. Then what are we supposed to do? Elijah stepped forward, his tone softer now but still firm. We follow the trail. Victor's arrogant, but he's also careful. If we can find what he's protecting, something he doesn't want exposed, we'll have leverage. And where do we start? Desmond asked, skeptical. Elijah glanced at his desk, where a folder sat unopened. The mansion you found wasn't just a holding site. Victor left behind clues there, likely on purpose. I've sent a team to recover anything we might have missed. Until we know more, we hold steady. Desmond frowned, but he didn't argue. Talia looked between them, her uncertainty clear. As the conversation settled, Elijah's phone buzzed. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the message. What is it? Desmond asked. Elijah set the phone down carefully. The team found something. A ledger, detailing payments tied to Victor. And? Talia asked. Elijah exhaled sharply. And it includes names. Your mother's and mine. The room fell into a stunned silence. Desmond and Talia exchanged a wide-eyed glance, but Elijah's expression hardened. Victor isn't just dismantling my legacy, Elijah said quietly. He's rewriting it. Elijah Crane sat in his office, the ledger open on the desk before him. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age. Yet the contents were as damning as fresh ink. Each line recorded payments that stretched back decades, funneled through shell companies into projects and properties bearing the Crane family name. Some were ordinary business dealings, but others painted a far darker picture. Desmond and Talia hovered nearby, their eyes locked on the same damning evidence. Desmond's jaw clenched as he scanned the names listed beside the payments. His mother, Yvonne Carter, appeared multiple times, alongside descriptions that hinted at something far more sinister than a simple employer-employee relationship. What is this? Desmond demanded, slamming his hand on the desk. Why was my mother's name in here? What did your family have to do with her? Elijah didn't flinch at Desmond's outburst, his eyes still fixed on the ledger. It's not just your mother, he said quietly. My mother's name is here too. And Victor's. Talia stepped closer, her voice shaking. What does that mean? Are you saying your father? Elijah leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. It means this ledger wasn't just a record. It was a map, something my father used to keep track of his dealings. Desmond's glare hardened. Don't dance around it, Crane. Dealings like what? Elijah's gaze shifted to meet Desmond's, his voice steady but laced with gravity. Extortion, blackmail, and in some cases disappearances. Talia's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her face pale. Disappearances? You mean people? Elijah nodded, his expression grim. My father had a way of making problems disappear. It's clear Yvonne was caught in that web. Desmond's fists tightened. You knew about this? You let it happen? I didn't know. Elijah snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. He exhaled, forcing himself to calm. This wasn't my doing. My father kept his cards close. Even Victor wasn't privy to all of it, which is why this ledger is so dangerous. Dangerous for you or for us? Desmond asked bitterly. For everyone, Elijah said. This ledger isn't just evidence. It's leverage. If Victor has a copy, he can control anyone whose name is in here, including me. Desmond's anger simmered, but his curiosity got the better of him. Why is my mother's name here so many times? What could she have known that made her a target? Elijah hesitated, his mind racing through the possibilities. The ledger was incomplete, but one entry caught his attention. A series of payments labeled under a cryptic code, Project Obsidian. It was tied to the same property where Talia had been held and dated back to the time when Yvonne had worked for the Cranes. There's something here, Elijah said, tapping the entry. My father was funding something he didn't want on the books, and Yvonne was connected to it. Desmond frowned. Connected how? Elijah stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. It could have been anything. She might have stumbled on something she wasn't supposed to see, or she could have been part of it. That's ridiculous, Desmond shot back. My mother wasn't some criminal. She worked for your family because she needed a job. That's it. Maybe, Elijah said without turning around, but whatever she knew, it was enough to get her killed. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy fog. Later that night, Elijah sat alone in his study, the ledger still open before him. He traced the lines of the entries, piecing together fragments of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. Victor's return, the cryptic markings on the mansion walls, Yvonne's disappearance. It was all connected. But how? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of his phone. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. His instinct screamed caution, but curiosity compelled him to answer. Elijah Crane, he said, his tone clipped. The voice on the other end was low and gravelly. Still playing the dutiful son. Are we? Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. Victor. Victor chuckled darkly. I knew you'd find the ledger. It's a good look on you, little brother. Digging through father's skeletons? How does it feel to know you're wearing his sins like a tailored suit? What do you want, Victor? Elijah asked coldly. Want? Oh, I already have what I want, Victor replied. You're the one who should be worried. That ledger is only half the story. The other half, well, let's just say it paints an even uglier picture. If you think you can intimidate me with half-truths, you're wasting your breath, Elijah said. Oh, this isn't about intimidation, Victor said, his tone turning venomous. It's about reckoning. Yvonne Carter wasn't just some pawn, Elijah. She was a liability, a loose thread father couldn't leave dangling. And do you know what happens to loose threads? Elijah's jaw clenched. If you had her killed, Victor, I swear. Spare me the threats, Victor snapped. You're no saint, Elijah. And when the truth about Project Obsidian comes out, the world will see you for what you really are. The line went dead before Elijah could respond. He lowered the phone slowly, his mind reeling. Project Obsidian. Whatever it was the key to everything. The reason for Yvonne's death, Victor's return, and the Crane family's descent into darkness. He turned as Desmond entered the room, his expression tense. What is it? Victor, Elijah said simply. He knows about the ledger. And he knows something I don't. Desmond's eyes narrowed. So what do we do now? Elijah closed the ledger and met Desmond's gaze, his voice firm. We find out what Project Obsidian was. And we end it. The night was quiet, unnaturally so, as the black SUV crept along the deserted road leading to an abandoned industrial site on the city's outskirts. The air inside the vehicle was tense, thick with unspoken fears and fragile resolve. Elijah sat in the back seat, his sharp suit creased at the elbows as he leaned forward, his expression grim. Beside him, Desmond's jaw was set in hard determination. Talia sat between them, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. This is the address Victor sent, Elijah said, breaking the silence. He's luring us into a trap. We all know that. And yet here we are, Desmond muttered. We don't have a choice, Talia said, her voice quieter but steady. If this is where we find the answers, then we face whatever's waiting for us. Elijah glanced at her, his expression softening briefly. For all her fear, Talia had the same fierce determination as her brother. He couldn't help but admire it, though it filled him with a gnawing unease. Victor's games were never simple. There would be more at stake tonight than just answers. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the looming warehouse, its windows dark and uninviting. Elijah's driver, Simmons, turned in his seat. Do you want me to stay, sir? No, Elijah replied. Take the car out of sight. If you hear gunfire, call the police. Simmons nodded, though his reluctance was evident. As the three of them exited the vehicle, the chill of the night air bit at their skin. Desmond held a crowbar he'd grabbed from his apartment, a pitiful weapon compared to whatever Victor had planned, but it gave him a sense of control. Elijah led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for movement as they approached the warehouse. He pushed the heavy metal door open, the creak echoing ominously in the cavernous space. Inside, the faint glow of hanging industrial lights illuminated the concrete floor, littered with debris and rusted machinery. You came, a voice echoed, smooth and mocking. Victor stepped out from the shadows, his tailored suit immaculate even in the dingy setting. He carried a small briefcase in one hand, his other tucked casually in his pocket. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve, little brother, Victor said, smirking. Elijah's voice was cold. What do you want, Victor? Want? Victor feigned surprise. I'm not the one with questions. You're here because you want something. From me? Desmond stepped forward, his anger barely contained. You killed my mother. You piece of... Victor raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. Careful, boy. You don't want to make threats you can't back up. Talia grabbed Desmond's arm, holding him back. Don't, she whispered. Victor's eyes flicked to her, and his smirk widened. Ah, the loyal sister. I have to say, Talia, you've been quite the troublemaker, but I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Your mother had a similar streak. Leave her out of this, Elijah snapped, his voice sharp. This is between you and me. Victor chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. Oh, Elijah, you still think you're the hero, don't you? Always trying to clean up father's messes, pretending you're not part of the same rot. Elijah ignored the barb, his focus unyielding. What is Project Obsidian? Victor's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a glimmer of something darker. Ah, so you finally stumbled onto the big secret. Father's crowning achievement. The thing that made him untouchable. He opened the briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents, holding them up for emphasis. This is what you've been looking for. The truth about Yvonne Carter. About your precious empire. Elijah's eyes narrowed. What's your price? Victor's laugh echoed through the warehouse. You think this is about money? No, Elijah. This is about power. About reclaiming what was stolen from me. Desmond stepped forward again, his voice shaking with fury. You destroyed my family. You used my sister as bait. And now you're standing here, acting like you're the victim? Victor's gaze snapped to him, cold and sharp. Your family destroyed itself, boy. Your mother knew the risks. She made her choice. That's enough, Elijah barked, stepping between them. If you want to fight me, Victor, then fight me. Leave them out of it. Victor's smirk returned, cruel and calculating. Oh, Elijah, you still don't get it. This isn't about fighting you. It's about breaking you. At his words, the lights above flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Armed men emerged from the shadows, rifles aimed squarely at Elijah, Desmond, and Talia. Run, Elijah hissed to the siblings. But before they could move, Victor raised a hand. Stay where you are. If anyone runs, they die. Talia's breathing quickened, her eyes darting between Victor and the armed men. Desmond stepped protectively in front of her, gripping the crowbar tightly. You've already lost, Victor, Elijah said, his voice icy. This isn't power. It's desperation. Desperation? Victor repeated, his smirk widening. No, little brother. Desperation is what happens next. Suddenly, Talia moved. Before anyone could react, she lunged forward, grabbing the briefcase from Victor's hand. Chaos erupted as Victor shouted for his men to stop her. Talia! Desmond screamed, reaching for her. But Talia was already running, weaving through the machinery as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. She clutched the briefcase tightly, her determination burning brighter than her fear. Elijah and Desmond fought back, knocking over debris to block the advancing men, but Talia was the only one fast enough to break through the line of fire. Her escape, however, was short-lived. A single gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the cavernous space. Talia stumbled, the briefcase slipping from her grasp as she fell to the floor. No! Desmond's anguished cry echoed through the warehouse. Elijah's chest tightened as he turned toward Victor, his eyes blazing with fury. Call them off. Victor's expression was unreadable, but he raised a hand, and the gunfire ceased. The room fell into a stunned silence as Desmond rushed to his sister's side, cradling her in his arms. Talia, Desmond whispered, his voice breaking. Stay with me, please. Talia's breaths were shallow, her face pale. She reached up, her hand brushing against her brother's cheek. It's okay, she murmured, her voice faint. You'll stop him. You have to. Her hand fell limp, her eyes closing for the last time. Desmond let out a guttural scream, his grief shattering the silence. Elijah stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides as rage and guilt warred within him. Victor watched from a distance, his expression cold. She made her choice. Elijah turned to him, his voice trembling with fury. This ends tonight. Victor's smirk returned. Oh, Elijah, it's only just begun. The warehouse was silent now, the echoes of gunfire replaced by the oppressive weight of grief. Desmond knelt beside Talia's lifeless body, his hands trembling as he brushed her hair back from her face. Her final words rang in his ears, a faint whisper that refused to fade. Elijah stood a few feet away, his fists clenched, his face a mask of cold fury. Victor had vanished into the shadows with his armed men, leaving behind a scene of devastation that mirrored the chaos in Elijah's mind. Talia was gone, and with her, the last vestige of innocence in this war. Desmond's voice cut through the stillness, hoarse and raw. "This is your fault." Elijah turned to him slowly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't pull the trigger." "You didn't have to," Desmond snapped, standing abruptly. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes blazing with anger. Everything, happened because of your family, your father, your brother, you." Elijah didn't flinch. The accusation hit its mark, but he refused to let the grief consume him. "Not now. I didn't choose this, Desmond. None of us did. But blaming me won't bring her back." "Blaming you?" Desmond's laugh was bitter, sharp. "You're not just to blame, Crane. You're complicit. You've been complicit this whole time." Elijah's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Desmond wasn't entirely wrong. He had spent years turning a blind eye to the darker corners of his father's empire, justifying his ignorance with hollow rationalizations. And now, Talia had paid the price. Desmond stepped closer, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You want to fix this? You want to make this right? Then stop pretending you're any better than Victor. Own it. Fight it. Or I swear to God, I'll burn your entire legacy to the ground." Elijah met his gaze, the fire in Desmond's eyes matching his own. Slowly, he nodded. "You want justice? So do I. But we can't do this alone." Desmond frowned, his anger giving way to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Victor thinks he's untouchable, but even he has limits. If we expose what's in that ledger, if we bring Project Obsidian into the light, he'll lose his leverage." "And what happens to you?" Desmond asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'll lose everything," Elijah admitted, his voice steady. "But that doesn't matter anymore. Victor took Talia's life. If destroying my name is what it takes to bring him down, so be it." Desmond's expression softened slightly, but his distrust remained. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I have as much to lose as you do," Elijah said. "And because you're right. This is my fault. It's time I did something about it." Hours later, Elijah and Desmond stood in the heart of Crane Industries' headquarters. The sleek, sterile office was a far cry from the chaos of the warehouse, but the tension remained palpable. On the desk before them sat the ledger, its damning contents now digitized and ready for release. Elijah's legal team had been dismissed, the security feeds disabled. He had made sure of it. No one could interfere with what was about to happen. Desmond paced the room, his movements restless. "You're really going through with this? Exposing your family's crimes?" Elijah nodded, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It's the only way to stop Victor. Once this goes public, every name in that ledger will be under scrutiny, including mine." "And you're okay with that?" Elijah met his gaze. "No, but Talia didn't deserve to die for my family's sins. Neither did your mother. If this is the price of redemption, I'll pay it." Desmond hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." Elijah's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, uploading the files to a secure server. With a final keystroke, the information was sent to multiple news outlets, whistleblower organizations, and law enforcement agencies. The Crane family's darkest secrets were no longer hidden. The moment was both liberating and suffocating. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "It's done." Desmond stared at the screen, his emotions a tangled web of relief, anger, and grief. "What happens now?" Elijah stood, adjusting his cufflinks with a sense of finality. "Now, we prepare for the fallout. Victor won't go quietly." "And what about you?" Desmond asked. "What happens to your empire?" Elijah's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "It was never really mine to begin with." As the first news reports began to break, Elijah and Desmond watched from the office, the weight of their actions settling over them. The Crane name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now the centerpiece of a sprawling scandal. Headlines screamed of corruption, extortion, and murder. Desmond turned to Elijah, his voice quieter now. You think this will be enough? It has to be, Elijah said simply. Victor thrives in the shadows. We've dragged him into the light. That's the one thing he can't control. Desmond nodded, his anger tempered by a flicker of hope. For Talia. Elijah's gaze softened. For Talia. Outside, the city buzzed with the news of the Crane family's fall from grace. But inside the office, the two men stood together, united by loss and a shared determination to see this fight through to the end. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of freshly turned earth and wilted flowers. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow over the rows of headstones. Elijah stood at the edge of the plot, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the gravestone in front of him. Talia Carter. A sister. A fighter. A light extinguished too soon. Desmond stood a few feet away, silent but present. His face was drawn with grief, his shoulders slumped under the weight of loss. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. She believed in you, you know, Desmond said finally, his voice low, even when I didn't. Elijah didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained on the gravestone, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. She believed in something bigger than me, bigger than any of us. Desmond scoffed softly, a bitter edge to his tone. She shouldn't have had to. None of this should have happened. She deserved better. Elijah turned to face him, his gaze steady. She did, and so did you. Desmond met his eyes, his jaw tightening. It's too late for that, Crane. What's done is done. Elijah nodded slowly, accepting the truth of those words. But it's not too late to make sure it doesn't happen again. Victor's still out there, and he won't stop until he's destroyed everything. Desmond's expression darkened. Then why are we here? Why aren't we hunting him down? Elijah sighed, his gaze shifting back to the gravestone. Because there's a difference between fighting for justice and fighting for revenge. Talia wouldn't want us to lose ourselves chasing him. She gave her life so we could end this, not so we could let it consume us. Desmond fell silent, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. For a moment, his anger faltered, giving way to something softer, something raw. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah straightened, his shoulders squared with quiet determination. We rebuild. We take what Victor tried to destroy, and we make it something worth fighting for. Desmond frowned, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. And what does that look like? It looks like making sure no one else has to go through what you and Talia did, Elijah said. It looks like turning the Crane legacy into something that matters. Desmond laughed bitterly. And you think I'm just going to help you with that? After everything? Elijah's gaze softened. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Desmond. I don't deserve it, but I am asking for your help. Because as much as I want to fix this, I can't do it alone. Desmond's expression hardened, his anger flickering back to the surface. You really think you can make this right? That throwing money at it will fix anything? No, Elijah said firmly, but it's a start. And if we can use what's left of the Crane Empire to build something better, isn't it worth trying? Desmond didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his eyes scanning the rows of headstones. The weight of his grief was still heavy, but beneath it was a flicker of something else. Something that felt like hope. All right, he said finally, his voice grudging. But if you screw this up, if you make this about saving your name instead of honoring her, I'll make sure the whole world knows. Elijah nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Fair enough. Weeks later, Elijah stood in the boardroom of Crane Industries, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed it in recent days. The scandal surrounding the Crane family had made headlines across the globe, dragging the company's reputation through the mud. But Elijah had been unwavering in his response, dismantling the remnants of his father's corrupt empire piece by piece. Desmond sat at the far end of the table, his arms crossed as he watched Elijah address the board. He still didn't trust him completely, but he had agreed to help oversee the newly established Crane Legacy Foundation, an initiative dedicated to combating the very injustices the Cranes had perpetuated for decades. As of today, Elijah said, his voice steady and resolute. "We are no longer a family business. Crane Industries will be restructured as a public trust, with all profits directed toward rebuilding the communities we've harmed. This isn't about redemption, it's about responsibility." There was a murmur of approval from the board members, though some remained wary. Elijah didn't care. He wasn't doing this for them. After the meeting, Desmond approached him, his expression guarded. "That was unexpected." Elijah arched a brow. "In a good way?" Desmond shrugged. "I'll let you know." They walked to the elevator in silence, the weight of everything that had happened lingering between them. As they descended, Elijah turned to Desmond, his expression earnest. "This isn't just about fixing what my family broke," he said. "It's about building something new. For Talia, for Yvonne, for everyone who deserved better." Desmond's gaze softened slightly, though his walls remained firmly in place. "We'll see if you mean that, Crane." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped out into the bustling lobby. The world outside was still reeling from the revelations of the Crane family's corruption, but for the first time, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent his life running from his family's shadow, but now he was determined to stand in its light and to make sure it didn't consume anyone else. As Desmond walked away, Elijah lingered for a moment, his thoughts drifting to Talia's sacrifice. She had believed in something bigger, something better, and for her, he would do everything in his power to make it a reality.